Well, you're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2, and we are currently on the campus of Columbia University in New York City, interviewing professors who are also authors. And we are now joined by Professor Todd Gitlin, whose latest book is called Occupy Nation: The Roots, the Spirit, and the Promise of Occupy Wall Street. This is not a finished book copy, but Professor Gitlin, could you tell us what this book is? This is not necessarily this is an ebook to begin.
It's an ebook on its way to being a physical book. That's how some books are published nowadays. But somehow it's in the keeping of the improvisational spirit of the Occupy Wall Street movement. This is a book attempting to come to grips with where this strange phenomenon came from and why so much of what was taking place there in Zuccotti Park and elsewhere was missed by mainstream journalism, and what the forebears of it are and what its differences are from previous movements as well as similarities, and what are the threads that are moving it forward.
Has Occupy Wall Street been successful to this point in your view?
Yes and no. The yes is that we're talking about it, that you now see bumper stickers that say 99%. I was just in upstate New York where I saw a candidate running for office with a sign that says the candidate of the 99%. It's now legitimate to talk about inequality and the domination of America by a plutocracy, by an oligarchy of the super wealthy. No, it's not successful in that it has not yet delivered concrete results, except for a few cases where it's succeeded in reversing a foreclosure or restoring some people who've been illegitimately evicted. But it's it's like many movements. It's in process. It's self-contradictory. It has its ups and downs. Has its popularities and unpopularities. It's a very American phenomenon.
Does it have a hierarchy yet? Is there a leader?
It does not have a hierarchy. Excuse me. It does not have a letterhead. It does not have a headquarters. It does not have a formal leadership, and I don't think it ever will. What it does have is actual leadership, people who are tested because they do things that other people in the movement approve of, and they gain respect. But I think that one thing this movement learned from the 60s is that it's dangerous to have known leaders. The celebrity goes to their head. Too much power to them and to the media that anoint them and elevate them and ridicule them. So I think this is actually, this leaderlessness, so-called, is not something that just cropped up last year. This is something that's been sort of the dominant tradition on the left now for 40 years. It's now the new dispensation. It's the new order of things.
Well, Professor Gitlin, isn't that kind of how the Tea Party started as well? Kind of leaderless and in different areas?
Well, yes and no. I mean, the Tea Party was summoned by a broadcaster on a television network. I mean, that's not exactly leaderless. The Tea Party is a complicated phenomenon, and if I can plug somebody else's book, Theda Skocpol and Vanessa Williamson have written very well about it. I hope you have them on your show. The Tea Party has a grassroots dimension, and it also has a Washington-centered, plutocratically financed face. It has a Republican Party face. Republicans in general are more accommodating to hierarchy. They follow the leader. They're not uncomfortable about that. The left is more rambunctious, more anarchistic, more anti-authoritarian, more suspicious of itself.
The ebook, is it constantly updated? Or not constantly, but do you update it?
I couldn't be here talking with you if we're constantly being updated. No, I mean, except insofar as at the various stages in which the book was readied, it came back to me and I could fiddle with things. I did add an afterword, along with some wonderful photographs by a photographer named Victoria Schultz, which will be in the physical book. But I must say, I'm pleased to discover on my most recent rereading that sort of the general outlines of what I have to say are still what I believe. So it didn't require any radical update. But life is long and movements are strange, and if there is an occasion, I'm sure I'll be back at the keyboard.
Todd Gitlin, 1963, 1964, you were president of Students for Democratic Society. What was that?
That was an attempt to collect the various strands of student protest on the left, whether against nuclear weapons or for civil rights or for participatory democracy on campus, and to provide a sort of home where people from these various movements could talk to each other and sort of work out what they had in common. It was really quite a small organization by today's standards, maybe 1,500 members when I was president, maybe 20 chapters, some of which were real, some of which weren't. And eventually, of course, it ballooned into this vast, sprawling, more notorious entity that became more and more militant, and ended up, when it was exploded, by faction fighting with probably 100,000 or more members.
So at what point did you leave that organization?
Well, SDS didn't keep membership rolls very assiduously. I would say I stepped away around 67, early 68. I no longer felt at home. I was one of the old guard, so-called. We were more methodical. I'd say we were more strategic and less wild and woolly than the newer crowd. And I was deeply troubled by all the theatrics that its various factions pulled as they were in the process of dancing off the cliff, and spent a fair amount of time denouncing what seemed to me reckless and unethical conduct. But so it took a number of wrong turns, very, very grave wrong turns, which the present movement, I must say, is delightfully, relatively free of. But I never ceased to believe, although I spent a lot of time investigating what had happened in this movement. In fact, I was already investigating it while it was still in the process of flying apart. And I wrote earlier books on the subject. I never really shook my conviction that this was a great democratic reformation, that this movement and everything that went on around it were the energy behind a regathering of democratic energies and a refocusing of democratic priorities, small d, that did this country a great service, helped end a horrible war, promoted civil rights and equality, racial equality, economic equality, provided a kind of foundation for ethical conduct among college students, and I think was a great renewing force. It also gave rise in various ways, not always expected, to the women's movement and the gay movement. It was a great liberating force with some severe pathologies.
You're a professor of journalism here at Columbia University.
Yeah.
Heavy media coverage in the 1960s of the student movements. How does that compare to media coverage of the Occupy movement?
Well, there were some disconcerting similarities, I have to say. Having studied pretty closely afterward the coverage of the 60s movements when I was writing my dissertation at Berkeley in the 70s, I frequently, looking at the coverage of the Occupy movement, sort of saw journalists not learning. That is to say, if it bleeds, it leads. That is to say, the skirmish at the edge of the crowd where some people are arrested and some ugliness breaks out between the cops and some demonstrators is a bigger story than, let's say, 20,000 people on the street as we saw in May Day, or actually as I saw, but most Americans didn't see because they couldn't be troubled to put a camera up overhead and shoot the crowd. A lot of trivialization of the demonstration, sort of the weirder, more exotic people, the more photogenic types get disproportionate attention. Shallow coverage in general was the norm. There were exceptions, important ones, and in the course of the 60s, I think a lot of journalists wised up as they came to appreciate that a social movement should not be expected to behave like an executive committee or a board of directors. That